Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. You can hear me okay? I can hear that you can hear me okay. I'm Hilary Davis. I'm on the academic board of Temenos, and it is my great pleasure tonight to introduce to you Sandra Hill, who is going to talk to us about the Mawangdui Funeral Banner, which is the earliest example of painting on silk, which has come down to us from the Chinese tradition. She's going to talk to us a little bit about how it was found, and she's going to tell us the implications of the most beautiful work that you can already see up on the screen there. Sandra teaches the Taoist element of the Temenos perennial philosophy course. She's currently doing a PhD at the Prince's Foundation School for Traditional Art in Indian and Chinese art. She's trained as an artist, but she's also lived in East Asia, and she studied classical Chinese with two very eminent French scholars. And she founded or co-founded the Monkey Press in order to help translate their work into English. So she is eminently qualified to talk to us about these two aspects, the Chinese and the art. So I'm going to ask you in a moment to welcome her, and then I will light the Temenos candle. We'll just have a moment's reflection to think about what we are going to hear, and then I will ask her to begin. So please welcome Sandra Hill.
Thank you, Hilary. Always after the lighting of the Temenos candle, I feel there should be at least half an hour's meditation. It always feels like a very sacred moment to me. So it's always very nice. Thank you, Hilary. Yes, it's always a great pleasure for me to talk about this wonderful painting. And you'll have to excuse me, I'm not used to talking to a microphone, and I always walk about, so I'll try not to walk about. But this is an extremely beautiful Chinese painting on silk that was made in the 2nd century BCE. It's a funeral banner, and traditionally it would have been held on a very long pole and processed in front of the funeral procession. And it's not difficult, it's pretty impossible to see, but it's got these sort of tassels hanging from the four corners, and they would be waving in the wind. So it was a very vibrant thing to actually see. And it actually serves as a kind of map or a guide for the soul after death. In fact, I should probably say souls, because in this time of the Chinese thinking, there were at least 2 souls. Sometimes it's considered that there were 10 versions, aspects of the soul, you could say. So what I'm going to do is to use the banner as, and I'll try not to keep turning. I have got a picture of it here. To use the banner as an illustration of this journey of the souls after death. On the handout I've given to you, I've given a little bit of the history and how the banner was found. I'll talk about that very, very briefly. But the imagery of the banner is an introduction to some of the sort of ideas that underpin the cosmologies and stories and legends that were current in this part of central China in the 2nd century BCE. The painting was actually discovered in 1972, and it was during the excavation of three tombs in an area of central China, which was part of the ancient kingdom of Chu. it's quite important that this is particularly the kingdom of Chu, which is in the south of China, which at the time was quite well known for a sort of shamanic tradition of Taoism, you could say. So this excavation at the time received a lot of attention because one of the three tombs, which is the tomb which held this banner, was remarkably intact, unusually intact, and including the body of a woman who's often referred to as the Marchioness of Dai, sometimes called Lady Dai. And her body was extremely well preserved to the point that the skin was still soft. So this was considered to be quite an extraordinary find, and lots of study has gone on as to how this was actually, was achieved. So the tomb was closed in 168 BCE, which was during the early Han Dynasty in China. And this was a relatively peaceful time after the unification of China under the first emperor. And it was an interesting time in that it wasn't just the land that was unified, but also the language that was unified. So at this particular time, it's considered to be a real flourishing of the arts of China, and particularly a gathering together of the texts, many of which had got lost at the time of the first emperor, because he was one of those, rather brutal individuals who was quite fond of burning books. And so the Han Dynasty is often considered, particularly this early Han Dynasty, is often considered to be like the first flowering of what is really a very distinct Chinese culture. So my thingy isn't working. Thank you. I'm just going to check that thank you. Okay, so this is a little bit about what was in the tomb, which again, this is what you have on your handout, so I won't talk about it too much, apart from the fact that there were many, many manuscripts in the tomb, and including two versions of the Tao Te Ching, the Lao Tzu, or the Book of the Way and its Virtue. And at this time, it really gave an impetus to the study of classical Chinese texts, because this was the earliest text that was existing of the Lao Tzu at that time. And also there were several medical texts. And this is a kind of reconstruction of a beautiful illustration of people doing health exercises in 2nd century BC, which I think is absolutely wonderful. And they're doing what would be considered nowadays to be what we would probably call Dao Yin, or what became later something like Qigong exercises. But I think they're just the most wonderful exercises and images. So one of the reasons why the body was so well preserved, and this was seemingly quite common at the time, but of the three tombs that were discovered, and the Marchioness, or the lady, was the only one that hadn't been disturbed in some way. The others were her son and her husband. But it was quite common that there would literally be 3 layers of coffin, and some of them would have mercury in between the coffins, and they were made of particular kind of wood which was sealed in a particular way. And I think in the museum of the Mawangdui excavations, I think they're still doing quite a lot of research into this, the processes that we used. So this was the outer coffin, and this is a close-up of an illustration of part of the outer coffin. So the whole of these outer coffins were decorated with these incredibly intricate and ornate patterns. Mostly, as we see here, this is a sort of interweaving of lions and dragons. And this next image is, again, it's a very common image found in this time in China, which is like these swirling mists which are considered to be like what we would call the movement of qi in the universe, basically. So the vital energy, the movement of the vital energy. And this is a close-up, and we see these little figures, which we'll see again in the banner, which are kind of little spirits and sprites that here literally look as if they're kind of riding on the clouds, or almost like they're surfing the clouds. Quite extraordinary little. The whole of this imagery is really interesting because it's got a sort of fun element to it. It's quite humorous, and quite a lot of the way these little faces of the spirits have been drawn. It's like they're sort of little sprites that are kind of playing with the universe almost. Okay, so the funeral banner, they're usually referred to as banners for guiding souls in their ascent to heaven. And it's quite a common image. I think the one that we have is probably certainly a very, very fine example. And it reminds me of, I remember many years ago going to see that exhibition at the British Museum of the Egyptian Book of the Dead. And you could see, depending on how much money the client had, they'd either have an incredibly refined version or a slightly rough version. And there are quite a lot of rough versions of the similar kind of banner. But this one is very exquisite and considered to be a very, very fine example of painting at the time. So again, this information I think you have on the handout, just a little bit about the dimensions of the banner. But importantly, it was laid on the top of the innermost of these three coffins, and it was held in place by what's called a B disc or a jade disc, which you might be familiar with. There's often a lot of jade discs in various museums, and this one is a picture I took in the Musée Guimet, which is of a particularly beautiful one. The markings of the jade are very lovely, but there's a couple of them in the British Museum. They're about this kind of size, quite large, and sometimes they were literally placed over the body in the tomb, or in this case, they were placed on the top of the tomb, holding the banner in place. And we'll see in the banner itself that there's more or less an image of one of these jade discs right at the center of the banner. It's considered to be the circle of heaven, and the idea is that life is able to manifest through the ring in the center of the circle as it was. Okay, so one of the things that we notice straight away with this banner is that there are 4 dragons. And the dragon is an incredibly important symbol I'm sure you're all aware, it's one of the most important symbols in China, and it's used in many different ways, but it's to do again with this intertwining of the energies, what we would say between heaven and earth, and the coming together of these energies to create life. And there are 2 dragons in the upper part of the banner, and the upper part of the banner, which we'll probably come to last, represents the sort of realm of the immortals. The lower part of the banner is to do with the coming together to make life, and then a descent also of afterlife. So in the center of the banner, these 2 dragons actually come together through the disc of the bee, of the heavenly disc. So dragons are usually considered to be like intermediaries between heaven and earth, literally sometimes seen as the life force or the qi. And one of the most important things in this banner is the constant differentiation of aspects of the yin and yang, usually shown by color, sometimes shown by literally the movement of things. But we also see that, for example, there's a white dragon, probably used to be more of a pale blue. The blue colors have faded a little bit. And the red dragon. The red in the banner was a paint from cinnabar, which has got an extreme long life. So it's extraordinary that the red colors are still almost as new. So yin and yang, we see, and we'll talk about this more as we go through, represent the energies of heaven and earth and the movement and interaction between them. And then we have these two terms, which I'll be explaining more as we go along, which in Chinese are the hun and the po. And these represent the two aspects of our soul. Again, using a translation like soul of any Chinese term is not an easy one, but there are two aspects of our being, which are non-physical. And there's a yin soul, which belongs to the earth, and a yang soul, which belongs to heaven. And at the moment of death, these souls have to undo their intertwining, as it were, and the yang soul must be led to heaven, the yin soul is merged back to the earth. So they combine in life, and they need to separate correctly at death. So it's this correct separation of the souls at death that's considered to be the main part of sort of funeral rites, you could say, at this time. And this is just a little line from the Songs of Chu. Chu is the area of China, southern China, where this tomb was found. And it's a description of the journey after death, which says, above, all the way to the doorway of lightning, below, all the way to the great abyss. So we're going to follow these two different directions as they're explained in the banner. So these two yin and yang dragons, they intertwine through this heavenly disc to create life. And coming from the center of the disc, we can see a kind of trail. It almost looks like a sort of curtain coming down, which is created from the meeting of these yin and yang aspects of the vital force. Probably some of the colors of the kind of geometric patterning of the curtain as it comes down might have faded a little bit, but quite a few commentators have said that the colors represent the 5 elements. And at this time, it was really just the beginning of what was called wuxing, 5-element, and yin-yang theory coming to be the sort of predominant way of looking at the cosmology at that particular time. It was at the beginning of this era that they were beginning to talk a lot about the 5 elements and yin-yang theory, which became the basis for a lot of the later theorizing. And also an interesting correlation with chapter 42 of the Tao Te Ching, which is one of the very often quoted chapters, that says the Tao gives birth to 1, 1 gives birth to 2, and the 2 being the yin and the yang. 2 gives birth to 3, which usually is seen to represent the life force, and 3 gives birth to the 10,000 things. The 10,000 things are a way of describing everything in manifestation. So the 10,000 things lean on the yin and embrace the yang, and their powerful blending of qi makes harmony. Now, this powerful blending of yin and yang is so crucial to so much Chinese imagery and folklore and legends. And this is actually a copy of a painting that was discovered in the Dunhuang tombs. And they're very large paintings, maybe 20 foot high. And they now got a couple of them on show in the National Museum in New Delhi. But they're paintings that come from a very ancient source, and Fuxi and Nugua are considered to be male, female, almost like the progenitors of the Chinese race. And they hold a compass and a square. which is reflected again in this text from the Huainanzi. And the Huainanzi is a text that was written or collated or written around the same time as the banner was made, which says, in ancient times when heaven and earth did not yet exist, there was image without form. Dark, obscure, formless, soundless, fathomless, profound, no one knows its gate. Two spirits merged into life to regulate heaven and organize earth. And this idea of the regulation of heaven and earth is through the compass and the square. So that they're always, and again, this is a rubbing, a bronze rubbing from about that same time as the banner was made. And again, there's always this intertwining of these serpent tails representing the sort of generation of life. So as we move down from this sort of knot of life and the representation of the 10,000 things manifesting from this coming together of the yin and the yang, we follow the descent of what are the earthly souls, because the souls that belong to earth have to descend back into the earth. And directly below this curtain, or this emanation of manifestation, there's a plinth. And on the plinth, there's the scene of a banquet. And there are various pots and vessels, and usually counted as 7 figures, which at this time, it was considered that the body had 7 aspects of soul. And numbers are used extremely symbolically in the Chinese, always. And 7 just always represents a good organization of something. Some people say that they almost represent 7 different doors and gates that have to be guarded through the body. And usually this idea of the earthly souls, which are known as the Po, they tend to be in charge of the sort of mechanical, natural forces of the body, which allow the body to move and to work and to digest, and to the sort of what I would call the autonomic nervous function of the body, which allows things to go on automatically. So these souls are said to be in charge of the intelligence of the body, almost like the intelligence of the cells. They know how to keep the body alive, and they also have cravings, because without this sort of understanding of the body to stay alive, there wouldn't be a sort of will to exist, as it were. So they're almost involved with this very basic will to live. And so they experience hunger, they experience thirst, and they experience sexual desire. And if they're not satisfied at death, they become what are known as hungry ghosts. And all through the Far East, there are very, very commonly referred to this idea of hungry ghosts, which, if they're not satisfied at death, will cause various kinds of hauntings. So they have to be fed. So this is why they're provided with a banquet. And they need to be given all that their body requires, so that they'll remain within the body for a long enough time to dissolve efficiently, so they won't start wandering around. Because they just want to fulfill their normal appetites, the appetites that keep the species alive, as it were. So they're not considered to be bad necessarily, but they're just sort of don't quite realize they're dead usually. That's usually the idea. So this idea of having a banquet at in the funeral rites is extremely important. And this is, again, something from the Songs of Chu, which is take rice, millet, and wheat, as well as yellow sorghum, pastries, honey, and flatbreads, as well as delicious cakes, drinks the color of precious stones perfectly prepared, filling the bird cups. All is in readiness for a splendid banquet with drinks the color of agate. This goes on for pages and pages in the Songs of Chu about how you properly prepare for this banquet for your earthly souls. So just below the banquet, and in fact, you can see on the left-hand side, this is the sort of edge of that plinth. So they're literally standing either side of this sort of banquet plinth. There are these rather strange tortoise turtle creatures with long tails, and each one has an owl sitting on its back. And these are creatures that can move between the worlds. They can move between the physical world and the underworld. There are different ideas about how exactly they work, because at this time there's so many different there's been many different interpretations of this banner. Some of it based on this poetry called the Songs of Chu, but different people have different ideas. One is that the owls actually acted as the eyes of the tortoises because they couldn't see in the dark, and they're about to go into what's known as the dark abyss, which is the underworld. There's extremely fascinating details which we can see, but they're impossible to go into because there's so much to see in this particular image, and you see more every time you look at it. But the turtle on one side is treading on the dragon and treading on the plinth because it needs to stabilize itself, because it's the yin turtle. On the other side, the turtle is completely free. And these sorts of imagery you find almost in every aspect of the banner, and they're always considered to be a sort of description of the yin and the yang balance within this whole painting, it's very elaborate. So this is the underworld. So certainly in the sort of legendary and mythology of this time, but also based on what was considered to be a growing medical knowledge at this time as well, the underworld is a place of watery darkness. It's related to the north, it's related to the water element. It's a place where things go to be regenerated and renewed. There's no concept of a place of punishment. This absolutely doesn't exist. It's simply a place where physical matter is dissolved and broken down and regenerated. So nearly all the images that we see in this underworld are images of fertility and regeneration. Now, supporting the platform, there's this rather strange figure, quite unusual in this kind of imagery, a sort of Atlas figure that's not holding up the world, but is holding up this platform of the banquet, supporting it and standing on these two giant fish. Now, giant fish are also very well represented in the early Chinese, particularly the Taoist texts, as being creatures of great fertility that exist in the northern oceans. So they're a very common creature to find in this thing. The idea of the dots on the fish are considered to represent their kind of fertility, the sort of almost like the spawn of the fish. So there's quite a bit of speculation about who the character actually is. He's sort of sometimes seen as the warrior of the north, an unusual thing because the warrior of the north is usually shown with lots of armor and quite a strong figure, but nobody quite agrees on who he is or what his name might be. Possibly there's a character called Xuan Ming in some of the legends, and Xuan Ming literally means the dark abyss. So all of this is about darkness and depth and water and regeneration. Related within the 5 elements and of the seasons of the watery darkness, and with winter, and again with the regeneration of the year. So the snake, the red snake, also a symbol of transformation, and he's also red, which means he's got this yang quality of movement and transformation, but he's also tethered. Around his neck there's a ribbon which is actually tethering him to the leg of the giant holding up the platform. So he's a yang creature, he's a creature of transformation and movement, but he's tethered, so he's actually not able to leave this domain of the physical restraints of matter, as it were. Now, again, this is a very common image that we find all over China, and this is the tortoise and the snake, which again, each direction of the Chinese compass has an animal related to it, and the north always is represented by the tortoise and the snake. And again, some of these creatures standing on the side. Similar to the ones we saw on the casing of the coffins. So coming back to, we can see that there's a couple of creatures, sorry, something just flashed up on the screen. A couple of creatures just sitting on the top of this sort of curtain coming down, which are sort of possibly her ancestors. The ancestors of the lady come to guide her. We're not quite sure, but very often there's this concept of bird men, of being immortals or ancestors who've become immortal. So directly above this central knotting of the dragons, there's another plinth or a bridge. This time it's the crossing over to the upper worlds. And in the middle, we have the image of the woman herself. She's dressed as a noble woman, and to her left, we have the two men kneeling down, who are possibly there to act as her guides to the upper worlds. And the interesting thing about the woman, and about the particularly from the things that were found within the tombs, and I don't think I mentioned this at the beginning, is that it was very clear that she was a Taoist adept. From the texts that were with her, from the implements that were with her, it was it's considered to be quite clear that she was a practitioner of Taoism. So these could be her teachers. These could again be ancestors who are coming to guide her up to the upper worlds. But standing behind her, there are three figures which are considered to be her three hun, or her three heavenly souls. Now, in some texts later, sometimes they talk about the hun and the po, which are very ancient ideas in Chinese thinking. It was really at this time that they started to talk about the idea of there being 3 and 7. Other times they just consider there to be one heavenly soul and one earthly soul. So it's something that changes over the time. And when we have the 3 and the 7, it's really just an aspect of different functions within that. So as the Po were in charge with the bodily intelligence and the kind of more mechanical functionings of life, the Hun are considered to be aspects of consciousness which can travel and separate from the body. During life, they're held and drawn back to the body by the Hun. So the Hun and the Po have a kind of magnetic attraction to each other almost. So if the Hun wander off in dreams or in meditations, or as we're in the realm of the songs of Chu, possibly shamanic journeying, they will always be anchored back to the body by the Po. But here they're free. Here they've lost their connection with the body. They've lost their connection with the bodily intelligence, as it were. And so they need to be guided. up to heaven or up to the immortal realms. So above her, above the plinth, there's probably the only almost empty space. Otherwise, this banner is incredibly full of imagery. And this empty space is usually considered to be the void between heaven and earth, as it were. So she's got to navigate this aspect of the void. And here we can see that the dragons are actually turning their back on each other. So there's actually no more communication between the yin and the yang here. They're turning their back to sort of make the space also for her souls to ascend towards the gate of heaven, which is above and which is guarded by this strange bat-like, bird-like creature, which is the guardian of the gate of heaven. Again, looks a little bit like an owl, also a bit like a bat. And there's quite a lot of reference in the songs of Chu to something called a four-winged bird, quite vague, but this is possibly the four-winged bird that is a guardian of the gate of heaven. And above the bird is a red canopy, known as the heavenly canopy or the tiangai, which again is a very common term in Chinese. You often see pictures of people in chariots, particularly going up to heaven, with a canopy, almost like a sort of umbrella over, which is called a tiangai or a canopy of heaven. And above, sitting on this sort of platform, again, there are two birds, and these are phoenixes. And as in the north, in the watery darkness, we had the snake and the tortoise, which are representatives of that element. Here we have phoenixes, which are representing the light and the fire element and the aspect of transformation. So both the flower in the center, is a kind of image of a flower, which is also representing the idea of transformation. So in order to go through this gate of heaven, there's a kind of transformation that's taking place. Yeah, sorry, that's a closer image of that. And directly above, you can see the beginning of these sort of gates either side of the flower. And sitting just on that platform are these two more male attendants. And also two leopards. And again, we saw the red leopards below as well. And these leopards, again, from the songs of Chu, there are tigers and leopards at the 9 passes. By biting, they're an obstacle for the people from down here. So they kind of constantly making sure that the wrong people don't get in, I think, at these different levels of these gates. So passing through the gates, we come to this upper realm, which is usually considered to be the realm of the immortals. Sometimes called paradise, but I don't know whether that's really a fitting description. I think the realm of the immortals is probably better. It's beyond the material world. There's no longer the draw to be brought into life, as it were. You've gone through the gate and there's a sort of release into the immaterial world. So here again, there are 2 dragons, but the dragons are quite independent from each other. They don't move, they don't interact with each other in the same way as they did. So they're not coming together to create life in the same way. They still have some yin and yang attributes. For example, one has wings, which is always a sign of a kind of flying creature, which is considered to be a yang aspect. The yin dragon, which is on the right-hand side, is actually standing on what is a tree. It's not very clear to see that, but we'll see it closer as we go along. The sun above the right-hand dragon contains a crow, and this is again a very, very ancient symbol for the sun. So the sun is a bright red disk. On the other side, there's a moon, a crescent moon, which possibly just the first appearance of the moon, which again is this suggestion of regeneration and transformation. So there's the black crow in the sun, and again, there's a little bit, a nice little section in the text of the Huainanzi, which says, in the sun, there is a three-toed crow, in the moon, a spotted toad. And here we have, not so easy to see because this corner of the banner was a little bit degenerated, but we can just about make out this toad. And he's a spotted toad. And above the toad, there's a hare. And again, traditionally, there's nearly always a toad and a hare, sometimes a hare or a toad, but one or the other will always be in the moon. And the hare, this is a rather more modern picture, but this is an embroidery of a hare, and the hare is in the moon, and he's making the elixir of immortality. So he's pounding various herbs to make the elixir of immortality. This is a very, very common image. In this, as you can see, this is not an ancient bit of fabric that's been embroidered, but so this, you'll see this image of the hare in the moon is a very common image. So below the sun, there's a dragon, which is associated with the sun, but he's partly obscured by the branches of a tree. And the tree houses 9 suns. So actually 8 suns and the sun which is above. So sometimes also considered to be fruits of the tree, but usually translated as being the 9 suns, which again are part of a very, very famous legend, which, yeah, there's a little bit of a thing from another book of the Mountain and Seas, which is on an elevation in the Valley of the Sun. There's a mulberry tree called Fusang. So this was a mulberry tree where the dragon is resting. One sun arrives as another one leaves, and all of them are carried by a crow. So this is part of a legend where these 10 suns take their turn in coming up to illuminate the earth, and then they rest in this tree overnight, as it were, and then they come back again. But as legend has it, there was one time when all the 9 suns came out at once, and the earth started to burn. So there was a heavenly archer by the name of Yi who shot down 8 of the suns, and the earth was saved from disaster. And this is one of those, again, a very famous myth that's sort of mentioned again and again in various Chinese texts. And one of the versions of the legend suggests that as a reward for shooting down these suns, he was given the drug of immortality. And another aspect of the legend describes that it was stolen from him by his wife. And some translators of the banner suggest that his wife is there sitting on the wing of the other dragon, about to steal the drug of immortality. But also there's a suggestion that because she stole the drug of immortality, she was turned into the toad. So there are quite a few different versions of these stories, but it's full. It's almost like the banner contains so much imagery that's from so many different versions of various legends as well. It's like it's sort of all contained and can be translated in quite a lot of different ways. I think one of the important things about the imagery and the poetry of this time is that it allows many different interpretations. It's almost deliberately allowing us to interpret the imagery in different ways. I prefer to think of the woman on the wing of the dragon as the woman herself, as the Marchioness or the Lady of Dai, who is being taken up to heaven on the wing of this dragon. And this again from the Song of Chu: mounting the flying dragon, I make my chariot of many precious stones. Driving the 8 dragons that undulate, I carry my standard of clouds that coil in spirals. And again, it's full of this kind of imagery of coiling and spiraling and clouds, which is so common at this time. So this is this figure right at the center of the top of the banner, and again has been translated by different commentators in different ways. For me, the most accurate of the time, sort of considering she was a Taoist adept, one would consider that this is now the woman herself who's been transformed into an immortal. And the idea of showing the immortal as having this serpent tail, as we saw with both Fuxi and Nugua, the progenitors of the Chinese race, as it were, the couple that were intertwined. She's sitting alone. She has her hair down in a very sort of relaxed way. Her hair's falling over the spiral of the serpent tail. And she's wearing a white robe. Now, usually in Chinese paintings of this time, you'd be able to tell the sort of sex, the status, everything about the person from the headwear, because they all have different kinds of headwear and hairdos. And this is very much almost like even the Taoist priests of today don't cut their hair. They wear their hair totally loose and long. And this is a sort of image of someone in a total repose. She's got her eyes closed. She's wearing a pale garment. So the pale garment suggests that she's sitting in meditation in a yin state, but she's surrounded by these spiraling coils of the serpent, which are representing a sort of yang energetic force that's still surrounding her. So it's quite an extraordinary image. Yeah, I think just this is a really beautiful text from from the Tao Te Ching, which just talks a little bit about this idea of this sort of the Taoist meditation, the quietness of the Taoist meditation. So can you hold your soul? How can you hold fast to your soul and not let it wander? Can you make your breath as soft as a newborn baby's? Can you wipe your dark mirror free of dust? Can you serve and govern without effort? Can you be the female at heaven's gate? Can you light up the world without knowledge? Can you beget things and keep things, but beget without possessing and keep without controlling? This is called dark virtue. So the woman is at rest. She's no longer engaged in what we call this dance of yin and yang, which is necessary to create life. And above her, I think there's altogether 5 cranes. They're not all in here, but there are cranes who again are sort of birds usually used as representing immortality, which are looking upwards and kind of calling. They've got their beaks open and they're calling. And but below her, there are 2 cranes that are diving down. And they're diving down into what is considered to be the axis of the world. And again, we've got these 2 strange creatures on the back of kind of horses that are holding on to the strings, which are often referred to as the handles of the Tao. In quite a few texts, we come across this term, the handles of the Tao. It's almost like a spinning top. It's the idea of this sort of spinning top, which is which is moved by the motion of these strings, and it keeps the world turning, as it were. And above, you can see there's sort of little dots, and then there's a little bowl. And from the bowl, I don't know whether you're able to see it very clearly, there's a kind of emanation. And it's like the cranes are swooping down in order to inhale this kind of emanation, as it were, that's coming from this turning of the top. And there's a very lovely quote, which comes from the first chapter of, again, this text called the Huainanzi. And again, these two august ones are representing these two original figures of Fuxi and Nugua, or here, almost represented by these two strange creatures on horseback. So the two august ones of high antiquity grasped the handles of the Tao, and so were established in the center. Their spirits mysteriously wandered together with all transformations, and thereby pacified the four directions. Hence they could revolve like heaven and stand still like earth. Always this idea of heaven as being moving and rotating and earth being still. Hence they could revolve like heaven and stand still like earth, cycle round and round without stopping, flowing unceasingly like water. They ended and began together with all things. As winds rose and clouds formed, there was no event to which they did not respond. As thunder rumbled and rain descended, to all they responded without end. Ghosts departed and spirits entered, dragons arose and phoenixes alighted. Like the potter's wheel turning, like the wheel hub spinning, they circled round and round. So a very beautiful description of this idea of a sort of potter's wheel turning and a wheel hub spinning, which is represented by this little image in the center of the banner. And finally, just another little quote from the Lao Tzu, from the Tao Te Ching. There are things chaotic and yet complete before heaven and earth were formed. Quiet, deserted, silent, solitary, standing alone and unchanging, extending everywhere but unscathed. Maybe this is the mother of all under heaven. I do not know its name. Let's call it Tao. Thank you.
I first heard Sandra talk about